seated. I have taken to doing an event with the dean that I report to at Kenyon on Tuesdays called Gratitude-Tuesdays. Some of you I know I've seen in Pierce on Tuesdays over lunch. And it's been a great thing, an idea that she came up with as a way of cultivating gratitude during the week, right? And cultivating awareness of what we have to be thankful for and nourished by in a world where those things can seem so often to get crowded out. And she was passing out this poem this week, and it really struck me as being quite appropriate for the start of our Lenten journey, actually. And it's by a woman I don't know, named Judy Sorum Brown, but it is entitled Fire. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs, packed in too tight, can douse the flames, almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between, as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way, we have learned to pile on the logs. Then we can come to see how it is fuel and the absence of the fuel together that make the fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings, in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. And again, I felt that image of fire, and indeed the image of fire that needs space in order to grow and be nourished by oxygen, reflects quite powerfully the image of our Lenten journey, particularly as we talk about the idea of fasting in Lent. Whatever it is we are fasting from, whether it is food or social media or any number of things, the purpose of fasting is to create space. I sometimes like to refer to Lent as a spring cleaning for the soul, a chance to create mindfulness and clear space of those things that are in fact crowding out the presence of God in our lives. Not that those things are bad, not that all of the many distractions in our lives, certainly not that food itself is bad, but creating space for where, in fact, the presence of God can find us, feed us, nourish us. And I think the helpful reorientation of that framing of Lent, rather than focusing on Lent as a time of denial or self-denial or misery for its own sake, and around how we create space for the activity of God, in fact allows us in Lent to focus less on ourselves and actually see God. And I feel like that is reflected in a very interesting way in our readings this morning, because we see two different stories that are sort of part of the root of this 40 days of Lent. We have the story of Noah and the 40 days and 40 nights Noah and his family spend in the ark, and the 40 days of Jesus' fasting and temptation in the wilderness. And what I find particularly interesting about our readings this morning is that while we see echoes of both of those 40-day periods in the readings aren't actually about them at all, right? So the reflection we have of the story of Noah is not actually about the time Noah and his family spend in the ark. It is about the end of the story, after they are through that period, which, let us remember, is a period of God's preservation of Noah and his family during the 40-day flood. But it is after that story, which is, let's be real, a challenging story of God's judgment. It's where I get on my soapbox again and I explain that Noah's Ark is not a children's story and we need to stop marketing it for, like, babies' nurseries. I have a lot of thoughts about that. But all of the Noah's Ark stories my children have been given have been living in a hidden shelf on the top of our closet, let me just say that. But what we have is the story after that image of God's judgment and justice, and the story of God's renewed covenant with God's people. And this covenant between God and Noah's family is seen as a prefiguring of the covenant God will ultimately form with Abraham. It establishes in the book of Genesis that God lives in relationship with God's people. The image of God as the God of covenant, relationship, of faithfulness, of preserving God's people. And I think it is an interesting parallel for us to see in Mark's version of Jesus' temptation. Because every year on the first Sunday of Lent, we read about Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And the lectionary compilers, I feel like, were a little bit stuck when they get to year B and Mark, because there's not really much for them to report on. So if you're paying careful attention to your lectionary cycle, you will recall that we have already heard this story a couple of times this year already in our reading about Jesus' baptism and the beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Judean countryside. We had some little filler text to bring into the lectionary this week because the actual story of the temptation that Mark gives us is basically a sentence. That it happened. But as is always the case with Mark, he might not give us a lot. He might not give us that great story of Jesus' temptation that we get in Matthew and Luke, where we have the three different temptations of Jesus, and we have Jesus' rebuttal to them, and there's a lot that can be unpacked and digested from that. But what Mark does give us is significant. And none of the details that Mark does choose to include can be easily overlooked. And I find it fascinating that what Mark tells us is that Jesus was driven out into the wilderness. He was there for 40 days. He was tempted by Satan. He was with the wild beast, and the angels ministered to him. Right? Unlike the story of the temptation that perhaps more of us are familiar with, where Jesus sort of goes through this escalating series of trials, after which the angels come and take care of him. What Mark gives us is the image of the angels being there perhaps the whole time. That while Jesus is in the wilderness, while we are in the wilderness of Lent, God is with us. This is a time when we have the gift of being fed and nourished by the presence of God in our lives. And I think that's a powerful reframing of Lent, rather than thinking of Lent as a time of deprivation to think of Lent actually as a time of nourishment, a gift. And much like that image of fire, right, that needs itself to be fueled, to be nourished, then gives light, warmth, the ability for preservation outward to the world around it. Lent is our opportunity to be renewed, to create space for the nourishing, inspiring presence of God, and then to be transformed into light and warmth and fuel for the presence of God outwardly to the world around us. I want to conclude just really briefly by noting the handouts that you will see at the door by the entryway to the church. Perhaps you picked them up. These are actually resources provided by the Episcopal Church called The Way, Reclaiming the Way of Love in Lent, and actually speaking of spiritual transformation and renewal. And my plan is to provide these each week, and they're just resources for prayer, for inspiration, for cultivating that presence of God in our lives, not just for its own sake, not just for the sake of checking off that you did the spiritual things in Lent, but actually in the hope and the faith that as we cultivate the presence of God's love in our lives, we are indeed transformed by the presence and nourishment of that love. And as we go through our Lenten journey, may be formed and shaped and transformed to share that love with the world around us. Amen. Thanks be to God.